The room went dead quiet the second the camera pushed in on the cockpit. My brother froze with his beer halfway to his mouth. My mother covered her lips. My father leaned so far forward in his recliner, it almost tipped. And for the first time in a very long time, nobody in that house had anything to say. On the television, the announcer's voice filled the living room. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Emily Parker. My name, my face, my aircraft live on national television. The same brother who had spent years treating me like I'd never amount to much was staring at the screen like he'd seen a ghost. My parents, who had always found a way to explain him and overlook me, couldn't look away. No one moved, no one spoke, because the pilot carving through the sky wasn't a stranger, it was me. The daughter they had underestimated, the sister they had dismissed, the woman they had stopped really noticing years ago, and the strangest thing was this: I had never hidden my life from them. I never lied, I never kept some grand secret, they just never paid enough attention to ask the right questions. But to understand how we got to that living room, that television, that silence, you have to go back much further. Back before the uniform, before the Air Force, before the cameras. Before the air shows, back to a small town outside Wichita Falls, Texas, back to when my brother's dream first took root, and back to the day it fell apart. My name is Emily Parker, I'm 34 now. But this story really starts when I was a little girl growing up in Texas with my older brother, Jake. In our town, people knew Jake. Jake was 3 years older than me, and when you're a kid, 3 years can feel like a lifetime. He was louder than I was, bolder than I was, more magnetic in every room he walked into. Teachers loved him, coaches noticed him, relatives asked about him before they asked about anyone else. At family gatherings, it was always the same. How's Jake doing? What's Jake up to now? Jake's going places. I wasn't exactly invisible, I was just second. And when you grow up in the shadow of someone everybody believes in, second place starts to feel normal. The funny part is, I adored him. When I was little, I copied everything. I wore hats like his. I borrowed his phrases. I followed him around so much he started calling me his shadow. I wanted his approval the way younger sisters often do, completely, quietly, and more than they probably should. Back then, Jake was my hero. And Jake loved one thing more than anything else: airplanes, not casually, not as a passing hobby. He lived and breathed aviation. Our walls were covered in aircraft posters. He had stacks of magazines about fighter jets, bombers, military history. Air shows were sacred in our family. Every summer, Dad would load us into the truck before sunrise, and we'd drive for hours just to watch military planes rip across the sky. Jake would stand there with this look on his face, half wonder, half certainty, like he wasn't just watching the future, he was meeting it. One year after an F-16 demonstration, he turned to Dad and said, "One day that's going to be me." Dad smiled and said, "I believe it." Mom said, "So do I," and nobody doubted him. Honestly, neither did I. Jake had that kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't just belong to a person, but spills onto everyone around them. As he got older, the dream only sharpened. He joined Civil Air Patrol. He studied everything he could about military aviation. He built his whole identity around becoming a pilot. Then, when I was 15 and he was 18, it all ended in a doctor's office. He came home that day quieter than I had ever seen him. No anger at first, no shouting, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something has broken beyond repair. Later, I learned what happened. He had failed a medical qualification required for the path he wanted. It wasn't about effort. It wasn't intelligence, it wasn't discipline. His body simply didn't meet the standard. And just like that, the future everyone had imagined for him vanished. What came after wasn't immediate. It happened slowly. First came disappointment, then anger, then bitterness. My parents were devastated for him, and at first so was I. Of course I was. Watching somebody lose the dream they built their life around is painful. But over time, sympathy turned into something else. Every family conversation became about Jake. Every problem became about Jake. Every excuse became about Jake. If he snapped at someone, it was because he'd been through so much. If he stalled out, if he blamed other people, if he stayed angry longer than anyone expected, it all got folded into the same explanation. He's hurting, and he was. But eventually, that hurt stopped being something the family helped him through and became something the family organized itself around. Meanwhile, life kept moving. mine included. One afternoon, while helping Dad clean out the garage, I came across an old aviation magazine. On the cover was an Air Force pilot climbing into a jet. I don't know how to explain it except to say that something inside me shifted. I stood there staring at that cover longer than I meant to. That night, I started reading about military aviation. Quietly, privately, I told no one, especially not Jake. By then, I already knew how that would go. In our family, flying had always been his dream. Even being interested in it felt like stepping into territory that didn't belong to me. Still, the interest grew. Then it became focus. Then it became a plan. I worked hard in school. I kept my head down. I moved toward that future one step at a time. And when I talked about military service, Jake laughed. When I brought up aviation, he rolled his eyes. The first time he openly mocked me, I was 21. We were sitting at the dinner table. I mentioned applying for officer training. Jake smirked and said something about that being ambitious. I let it pass. Then he said, with a little laugh, that I'd always been the one nobody expected much from. That was the moment I looked around the table and realized something that would stay with me for years. Sometimes the deepest hurt is what one person says. It's what everybody else refuses to say after. My mother looked down. My father said nothing. Jake leaned back like he'd won something. And I understood, maybe for the first time, that there are families where one person's wounds become so important that everyone else is expected to absorb the damage quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself, I just kept going. After college, I joined the Air Force. My family didn't take it seriously at first. Mom assumed it was a phase. Dad thought I'd come home eventually. Jake just laughed and asked how long it would be before I quit. I remember standing in my parents' driveway, my bags packed in the trunk, the sun setting over the Texas heat, and hearing him say it. "How long before you give up?" I looked at him and said, "I'm not quitting." He shrugged. "We'll see." That was my send-off, no pride, no encouragement, no big speech, just doubt. But by then, I had stopped expecting anything else. Military life changed me, though maybe not in the way people assume. It didn't magically turn me into someone stronger. It revealed the strength I'd had to build in private for years. Training was hard, really hard. The pressure was constant. The standards were unforgiving. Nobody cared how you felt. Nobody lowered the bar because you were tired or overwhelmed or doubting yourself. And I loved that. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being measured against Jake. I wasn't somebody's little sister. I wasn't the overlooked one. I was just Emily. My work was mine. My mistakes were mine. My progress was mine. That felt like freedom. At home, though, the old patterns stayed exactly where I left them. Every call with my mother somehow found its way back to Jake, his job, his frustration, his latest struggle, his newest plan. Then somewhere near the end, she'd ask how I was doing, not cruelly, just automatically. That may have been the hardest part, not malice, habit. One Christmas while I was home on leave, we were all watching football when a commercial with military aircraft came on. Jake pointed at the screen and said, "Remember when I wanted that life?" No one answered. Then he looked at me and said, "Guess somebody had to settle for being second best." My mother gave that nervous little laugh people use when they want tension to disappear without confronting it. My father cleared his throat, and once again nobody stopped him. By then, though, something in me had changed. It still hurt, but not in the same way. I had spent too many years building a real life to let someone else's bitterness define it. What I didn't understand then, but would understand later, was that Jake wasn't actually fighting me. He was fighting the version of himself that never got to exist. The problem was I had become the reminder. Years passed, my career moved forward. Training, qualifications, assignments, promotions. More responsibility, better opportunities. None of it came easily, but that made it matter more. There's a particular kind of pride that comes from building a life quietly. No applause, no audience. Just the steady knowledge that you kept your word to yourself. Then one day, while stationed in Nevada, I got an email that changed everything. At first I assumed it was routine, administrative. Scheduling, something ordinary. It was. I had been selected for one of the most prestigious aviation demonstration assignments in the Air Force. I read the message over and over, hardly breathing. It was the kind of opportunity pilots spend years chasing, the kind most never get. And somehow, after all those years of doing the work without fanfare, my name was on that list. That night I called home. A small part of me, some younger version of myself I thought I'd outgrown, still wanted my parents to hear something big and be proud. I told my mother I'd been selected for a major opportunity. She sounded happy for a moment. Then, almost immediately, she drifted back to Jake and whether he might change jobs. I hung up that call not angry, not devastated, just clear. By then I understood the rules of the family. I just wasn't living by them anymore. The months that followed were intense. The new assignment demanded more of everything: focus, discipline, consistency, precision. Every detail mattered, and I loved it. Back in Texas, very little changed. At a summer barbecue, Jake saw me wearing an Air Force shirt and made one of his usual jokes about how long I planned to keep playing soldier. A few relatives chuckled. My parents looked away. He asked if I was ever going to get a real job, and for the first time, I didn't feel wounded. I felt sorry for him. Because it hit me then that Jake was still living inside a story that had ended years earlier. Later that night, Dad sat beside me on the porch and admitted Jake had been hard on me. Normally, that's where the conversation would have ended, with a soft excuse, a half defense. But this time I asked him something simple. When was the last time anyone told him to stop? Dad had no answer. A few weeks later, a major television network announced live coverage of a national air show, the very one I'd be flying in. I knew my family would watch. Jake never missed an air show, and for once I didn't call ahead to explain anything. I didn't want to announce myself. I wanted the truth to arrive on its own. The morning of the event started before sunrise. Briefings, checklists, weather, safety procedures, final reviews, the kind of routine the public never sees and never needs to. By the time I climbed into the cockpit, thousands of spectators were already gathering. Families, veterans, kids with cameras, people who'd been attending air shows their entire lives. From the ground, those events look exciting. From inside the process, they feel sacred. Every movement depends on trust, discipline, and preparation. A few hundred miles away, my family was settling into their living room in Texas. My mother on the couch, my father in his recliner, Jake in the seat closest to the television. When the featured segment began, the network showed one of the pilots walking toward the aircraft, helmet in hand, flight gear on, face visible. Then the announcer said my name. Major Emily Parker. My father later told me Jake stopped moving altogether. My mother thought she'd misheard. Then the camera moved in closer. And there I was, not a lookalike. Not a coincidence. Not someone with my name. Me, the daughter they had treated like background noise. The sister they never took the time to know. The woman they had assumed would never become much. They watched the entire performance in silence. Every pass, every maneuver, every second of undeniable truth. No argument could have done what that moment did. No speech, no confrontation. Just reality. The next morning there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Jake was standing there. He looked like someone who hadn't slept. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then he said, "We need to talk." I let him in. He looked around at the photos in my quarters, flight school, squadron pictures, ceremonies, years of a life he had never really asked about. Finally he said, "I didn't know," and I told him the truth. "No, you didn't." We sat at a small table and had the first honest conversation of our lives. He asked when all of it had happened, the career, the flying, the air show. I told him over the last 12 years. It wasn't meant as a jab, but it landed like one because the point was unavoidable. None of this had been hidden. He just hadn't been listening. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I was proud of you," he said. And I hated that I was proud of you. That was the first moment I understood that what I had always experienced as contempt was, underneath it, grief. Not excuse-making, not innocence, but grief. He told me how humiliating it had felt to lose the dream that had shaped his life. How ashamed he had been, how stuck he had become. How every success of mine reminded him of the future he didn't get to have. And because he couldn't fight the loss, he fought the reminder. Me? Hearing that didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me sad, so many years wasted, so much energy spent resenting what could never change. A few days later, our parents joined us for dinner. At first, no one knew how to begin. Then my mother started crying, quietly, not dramatically, and she said, "We failed you." I had imagined that moment before, but reality was heavier and more human than I expected. Dad admitted they had spent so much time trying to protect Jake that they stopped seeing what it was doing to me. No one argued, because no one could. Later, as Jake walked me to my car, he asked why I had never told them, and that was when I gave the answer I'd been carrying for years. I did tell you, I said. He looked confused. So I reminded him. I told them when I joined the Air Force. I told them when I graduated training. I told them when I got promoted. I told them when I changed assignments. I told them again and again. What I hadn't had was their attention. He stood there quietly for a long moment and then said, almost to himself, "We never really asked." That was it. That was the whole truth. Over the months that followed, things changed, not dramatically but genuinely. My mother started calling to ask about my work. My father mailed me a newspaper clipping about aviation with a note that simply said, "Saw this and thought of you. Love, Dad." And Jake changed most of all, not overnight, but steadily. One evening, he called and told me he had signed up for flight lessons, not to reclaim the life he lost, not to compete, just to fly. And when I asked him how it felt, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Joy, the pure kind. The kind that had existed before disappointment hardened into bitterness. The following summer, my family came to another air show in person. We stood together under the Texas sun, my mother with sunscreen, my father with binoculars, Jake wearing an old aviation cap and grinning like a kid. After the demonstration, we sat watching the crowd drift away. Jake bumped my shoulder the way he used to when we were young and said, "I was wrong about you." I smiled and said, "You were wrong about a few things." He laughed. Then he looked at me and said, "I'm proud of you, Em." Those words meant more than the television broadcast ever did, because this was never really about strangers seeing me. It was about being seen by the people who had missed me for years. And looking back now, I think the biggest victory wasn't the air show. It wasn't the assignment. It wasn't proving anyone wrong. It was understanding that my worth had never depended on whether they recognized it. Not my brother, not my parents, not anyone. Once I understood that, everything got lighter. The success meant more. The hurt meant less, and the relationships had room to heal. If there's anything worth holding on to in this story, maybe it's this. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see us clearly. Sometimes they're too distracted by someone else's pain to notice our strength. Sometimes they underestimate us for so long that they forget to look again. But that doesn't mean our growth isn't real. It doesn't mean our work matters less. And it definitely doesn't mean we have to wait to be recognized before we become who we were meant to be. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or quietly dismissed while building something meaningful, keep going. You do not need applause to make progress. You do not need permission to become yourself. And one day, whether people notice or not, the truth of your life will speak for itself.